Hey guys, and welcome to the show. I have three guests today, kind of unusual, usually only one. And they're going to talk to us about Microsoft technology in the healthcare industry. We're going to focus on Surface and some security stuff, but this is going to be a lot of fun. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Hey guys, and welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about Microsoft in the healthcare industry. Kind of neat. I've never had this many guests, and I'm kind of excited about it. I've got Ben Smith, Tony Sims, and Matt Goggin with me. Hi, guys.
Hey, Lex.
Hey, Lex.
Hey, Lex.
Are you guys ready for this? Because this is going to be fun.
TGIF.
Ready as we will be. All right. Well, what I thought we would do is just have a general conversation about, Microsoft and what we're doing in that space. I know we have some topics that we want to cover. Surface, proactive approach to security, device security, cybersecurity, and endpoint protection. I don't really care which one of those we talk about first. Who wants to start?
Hey, this is Tony. I'll go ahead and start and kind of try to level set us on kind of what we're seeing in the cybersecurity space and kind of how Microsoft's addressing it.
Okay, awesome.
All right. So, if you've worked in the cybersecurity for a while, you're probably going to be, familiar with these concepts. But if you're not familiar with the changes that have occurred in, say, the last, 5 or 6 years, it's pretty different than it was, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago in cybersecurity. And the first thing I always bring out is cyberspace is a battlefield. And where that comes from is we are now dealing with not only just hackers and script kiddies and somebody trying to make money, but we're also dealing with nation state attackers. And a lot of these folks are coordinating their efforts across both their political realm as well as the cybersecurity realm, as you've seen in the U.S. over the last, say, 4 years, as we've been discussing things in the election. And this impacts healthcare as well. So if we look back at the WannaCry attack that occurred a few years ago, that was essentially a nation state type attack that impacted the United Kingdom's health system in a pretty devastating manner. So this is definitely a battlefield that we're all working on, and some people know it and some people don't. We know that cybersecurity skills are in short supply. There's just not enough of cybersecurity professionals out there. As you can tell by the video, I've been doing this for a few years and been around for a few years, and it reminds me of the days in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, when we didn't have enough information technology professionals to go around. And now what we've got is this issue with cybersecurity professionals, and it's across every country and every region and every industry. And healthcare tends to be a little bit underfunded in a lot of cases, and so they definitely don't always have the personnel to meet the requirement. And then we know that anything can be hacked. If you keep up in this space, it's really interesting. It's kind of fun to read. It's kind of like a little mix of James Bond and IT at the same time. But if you look at that through a healthcare lens, that could be an infusion pump that could be attacked. It could be a pacemaker that could be attacked. It could be some other medical instrument, or it could just be taking the hospital offline. So really, it's not just about Windows. It's not just about PCs. It's about really anything that's connected. So you have to think about security when you're buying a new connected device, whether you're a healthcare person or a consumer.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I would say that most people don't think about it, right? But when you think about a hospital and all the IoT style devices that are there, it's almost like, it's on par with a factory, right? With all the robots and stuff that build cars and all sorts of stuff. You've got a ton of devices in a hospital that are connected, and that, because of the fact that they are connected, are vulnerable to any type of attack, really.
Right. Yeah. The hospital was IoT before IoT was cool. They, all these devices have been connected for really decades and pulling telemetry data, which is great because that's what allows us to have this awesome healthcare. The problem is a lot of these devices are legacy. Some of them are running really old operating systems, and it's pretty easy to knock them over from a technical perspective and really cause some negative impact.
Yeah, but they're safe. They've got a firewall, right?
That's right. They've got firewalls. It's all good. All good behind the firewall.
Yeah, I joke about that a little bit, but the sad part is that there are a lot of people that think that way.
Right. Right. And we're starting to see people come around to this concept that, if you've got a flat network in a hospital and now you let somebody just plug into your network, you potentially have opened up an opportunity for something bad to happen.
Yeah.
As we just kind of continue to build on this concept, bad actors are always coming up with creative ways to attack organizations. And they tend to do two paths. One, lowest hanging fruit, easiest, cheapest way to do it, and then the sophisticated attacks. In healthcare, unfortunately, we tend to see the more commodity. Somebody didn't patch something, so I'm going to attack through that method. But they are very creative in these attacks. And when one thing gets fixed, they will always look for something else. And then, as we talked about with the devices out there, it's a broad surface. There's hospitals. And we think hospitals when we think healthcare, but honestly, it's hospitals, it's healthcare and health insurance companies, which we call payers, which tend to be a lot like a financial services company. And then you got pharmaceutical people, and that's the one that I should say life sciences. That's the people that are different in the U.S. healthcare space, because they actually have folks that travel to other countries. They have facilities in other countries, and some of those countries are not exactly friendly from a cybersecurity standpoint. And so it makes it difficult how do you secure that digital estate when the perimeter is no longer in your four walls, but it's anywhere that pharmaceutical rep or that salesperson or that representative goes in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And, one of the things that you mentioned is that those devices aren't necessarily running the latest and greatest software or /firmware. How do we protect devices like that?
Yeah. As we get into, further into this, there's multiple layers of protection that we provide. So when we think about it from a Microsoft perspective, what we look at is, are there ways that we can leverage the telemetry within the platform? Can we leverage the intelligence that we gather from protecting our environment and protecting all the different things like Office 365, Xbox, all these different organizations out there? And how can we leverage that information to better protect, everybody that consumes our software and uses our software, which is a large footprint? A lot of these numbers are kind of out of date. They're actually a lot lower than they are today. They just released some new statistics a couple of days ago. I won't go through all these, but just see that there's a lot of telemetry data that comes into Microsoft. And we use that telemetry data not just to detect threats, but also to build intelligence that we can then use to share with other organizations that are using Microsoft technology to better protect them. So an example would be, if I see a piece of malware in Asia and it's detected in Office 365, that detection could be protecting a Surface device running in a hospital in Kentucky, let's say. So this built-in intelligence becomes really important as we look at protecting. And then when we think about protecting, devices, and we're going to spend a lot of time on devices here in a minute, myself and Ben will talk about it. But when we think about Microsoft as a threat protection platform, we really focus on 5 things, but I tend to drill into 3 things. And those 5 things are identities, endpoints, user data, apps, and infrastructure. But what I tend to focus on is identities, endpoints, and data. Because in the end, that's what we're really talking about. The other stuff is kind of on the peripheral. But when I start thinking about the way attacks occur, they're usually going to hit an endpoint. Because if I compromise your endpoint, guess what? I can get to those infusion pumps. And they're, in a lot of cases, looking for user data because that's where the money's to be had, right? That's where we find patient files that we can then monetize. And then identity tends to still be the number one threat vector that we see. So when they phish you, they're trying to get your credentials, because if they get your credentials, they can then get into the network. So this is the way we frame that protection inside of Microsoft. And so what we're trying to do is build this infrastructure that's easier to protect by leveraging intelligence and by leveraging automation. And then as we continue to look at these threats, we want to make sure that at the same time we build user-centric focus around the security. So we want to be low impact to the user, but provide the security team with something that they can count on to protect their organization. Because what happens is if you don't make it user friendly, users try to get around security because they can't do their job. So they're going to try to go around security. And now they're working in conjunction with the attacker, even though they don't mean to be. And just to kind of tie off on this concept and to be really specific now, because you asked a very specific question, how do we, protect this? And this is really our threat protection stack and what it looks like. It starts at a very low level with our technologies down at the bottom, like Defender Advanced Threat Protection and Cloud App Security and some of those tools. But it builds up into our latest release, which was the Azure Sentinel product, which is a security incident and event management system, or information and event management system. Now, the thing I don't have on this screen, I guess I should have since of this conversation we're having today, is a Surface device. And so as we think about a Surface device and we think about securing it from a Microsoft perspective, a Surface device lights up all the security features within this Microsoft threat protection platform. So it's not that our other OEMs are not doing great things with their platforms, but I know that if I go buy a Surface device, I know that every switch for security that I can switch is available on that device. And I know that the hardware will support it, and I know that it'll be supported by the ecosystem. So that was kind of a whirlwind through Microsoft security, but hopefully that helped level set us.
Yeah, Tony, that was awesome. Thanks for that. You mentioned the Surface device. So I know Ben wants to talk about that. So Ben, you're up, bud.
Oh, great. And thanks, Tony. That great handoff. So actually, Tony and I worked together quite a bit. So it worked out great. So talking about the Surface device, just a lot of people think about a Surface device. It's just another computer, right? It's just like any other computer out there, any other endpoint. A lot of times we use general terms like endpoints, but I'll say a Surface device is really unique. It's not just another endpoint. And a lot of times when we talk about Microsoft 365, we reference it as the last mile, right? So you can make an investment in Microsoft 365 from our collaboration stack to our security stack. But if you're not realizing any of that on the device itself, it's really kind of a wasted investment. So can we bring that functionality and those capabilities all the way down to the end user? And the thing about Surface is it's not really designed to focus on the device itself. It's cool. It looks great. It's definitely a sharp looking device. It performs really, really well. But the whole idea behind Surface devices is we want to use an endpoint or this last mile to actually make the technology or the actual hardware disappear from the end user, and that they can get directly into their work quickly, get it accomplished efficiently, and that you don't have to do any sort of major issues. It just works all the time. And as far as security goes, like Tony was mentioning, kind of the model that we have, security at Microsoft is at the center of all of our architecture and our engineering across all of our solutions, whether it's a cloud service or whether it's a piece of software that you might run on premise, or it's even our hardware devices. And specifically with regards to Surface devices, we look at, and we make recommendations as well to our OEMs that we want a highly secure Windows 10 device. And we have a model that goes along with that. It's basically a cybersecurity reference architecture for hardware. It can be applied to endpoint devices like computers, IoT sensors that we talked about, kind of anything that's connected. And within Surface devices specifically, we look at this as a tiered security model. And we always talk about defense in depth and what does that mean. I've been doing security for a long time as well as hardware, and we talk about like the different rings and that perceptual, if we can build multiple walls and moats, that it makes it harder to get to the core or the castle that we're trying to protect. And from a Surface design perspective, we want to look at protecting the hardware itself, the firmware and the software, and we use that in a combined model to make sure that the device is as protected as it can be. The other thing I'll say about that is it's not static. If you look at a lot of the OEM devices that are out there today, or even other like non-Microsoft devices, the device when you buy it is pretty much as it's going to be throughout its entire life cycle. It's not going to necessarily become more secure. It might become less secure over time as exploits are found and discovered and implemented. But the thing about Surface is it's the only device in market that actually performs and is more secure at the end of its life cycle than it is at the beginning. What I mean by that is we are constantly working with the Windows group to release updates from the hardware side, if we're talking about firmware or the drivers, or how we interact with Windows, being able to turn on features like Windows Hello and things like that, and just improving that, is that when you see like, let's take a Surface Pro 4 device, if when it came off the line, it performed at a certain point, but at the end of its life cycle, it actually performed better than it did day one. And Surface is the only device in market that you can say that about. So going kind of back to that tiered model, and the other thing is we look at it from layering of independent defensive subcomponents. And that really gets into the idea of, you can have an attack and it may be intercepted or it may be detected, but you need to have a different layer and you need to have those systems. We used to think about, as long as I have antivirus, I'm good and that's good enough, right? Because I'm going to have threats. I'm going to do something. I'm going to, get a virus or something. But attacks are much more complex. And it can be down now to the level of social engineering, right? So how do we protect users from themselves? All kinds of the safeguards that we put in. And that gets into those multiple independent defensive subcomponents that we have from the hardware all the way to the operating system. And then again, like I said, mitigating constantly changing threat landscape, which it is constantly changing. And in healthcare specifically, one of the things that we see targeted quite a bit is, people don't think about it a lot of times, but we do take electronic payments. So we face the same challenges that you might have around POS readers or point of sale readers or point of sale devices, because we're storing credit card information or financial information for payment. Like Tony referenced, we work with a lot of payers or healthcare insurance companies, which actually have credit information on file. On top of that, obviously, we have PHI or PII, protected health information, which we definitely don't want out there as well. And hospitals are liable for that information. So there's definitely a security focus. But as Tony mentioned, a lot of times we work with chief information security officers that basically promoted up through the organization that may have some training, but aren't formally focused on maybe that own, security is its only or their only area. They may be a vice president of IT, have 80% of their job doing something else and 20% on security, with a staff of one person and two contractors. And that doesn't change over from year to year, regardless of what happens with the landscape. So from a Microsoft perspective, what we're doing is we're trying to protect our customers, even in areas to fill gaps where they can't provide those resources today. And that's through software, services, and hardware. And some of the things that Tony talked about, and he's probably going to talk about a little bit more, and I can get into a little bit later, is how we take all the services that we bring to bear from Microsoft and how we implement it in the way Surface devices are actually used by our end customers. And so I'm gonna kind of stop there and see, Lexi, if you had any questions or anything you wanted to ask about what I've covered.
Yeah. So there, as you were talking about that, there was one thing that came to mind that I think most people don't think about that you mentioned, right? And that is that you walk into, I'm just from a consumer standpoint, you walk into a Best Buy and there's 50 laptops there and they all run Windows, and you probably aren't thinking about which one of those devices is more secure because, initially in the consumer mindset, hey, they run Windows, I'll get Windows Update, they'll run Windows Defender. They'll all be equally secure, but really the truth of the matter is that they aren't, because we own the hardware. And we can update the firmware on those devices and push security-related fixes. And when you mention firmware, a lot of people may not realize it, but we've got TPM chips, we've got all sorts of stuff that are hardware based on those devices that are important to keep updated, and so you're right. It can be an incredibly secure device, especially when we're managing it end to end.
And you make a couple of really good points that you brought out there. So if you think about it, even from a consumer perspective, when you get a device and it's updating via Windows Update, most people think that you're just updating Windows components, or maybe Microsoft software components are coming via Windows Update. But for Surface devices, we're actually patching firmware or updating firmware and drivers right through Windows Update. So if you were, let's say, a consumer and you went and bought a device, the first thing it does when it comes out of the box, or we call it the UBI or out of the box experience, the first thing it's going to do before it actually gives control of the device after you first power it up over to the end user, it's going to go out and check for updates. That's by design, right?
Yeah.
So as soon as you get a hold of the device, it's secure. And the other thing that I think Microsoft was really smart about in the investment in security and not tying it to some like financial gain where a lot of companies do, is we're really trying to protect the entire ecosystem. right? And we're trying to do what's best for everybody, the consumer, the commercial industry, the different industries that we cover. And one of the things about Surface devices, whether if you buy a consumer device that comes with Windows 10 Home on it versus a commercial device that comes with Windows 10 Pro on it, all of our devices ship encrypted, right? You were talking about TPM 2.0 and that we have already in the device. But what we do is we use BitLocker, and we already have the devices encrypted as they ship. So a lot of times, end users are going to say, well, I leave that to IT, or especially in scenarios where, I'll bring up, and Tony can talk to this as well, as one of the trickiest scenarios we have is our BYOD scenarios. So where you've got consumer devices where people are bringing their own devices into a fairly secure environment like a healthcare organization, and it's connecting to corporate resources. And it's not necessarily controlled by policy if you're using like classic Active Directory or System Center Configuration Manager, because you may not be deploying those things to those personally owned devices. But through like Azure Active Directory, and joining to your company through Azure Active Directory, and then managing it with Intune and designating that device as a BYOD device, we can still deliver all the layers of protection we're talking about without impacting it being an owned device by an individual versus an organization.
Yeah. And one more thing to mention, you mentioned Intune. We can push policies via Intune, and security isn't just about having the latest updates and firewall, settings, et cetera, right? A lot of that is dependent on what we allow customers to do with those devices, especially in a managed device environment. So that's a great point.
No, and absolutely. And to Tony, another point that Tony made, and he steals some of my thunder usually, is that as we release updates for Intune or for Azure AD around policies with different versions of Windows 10, before we even release those, we make sure that all of those features and functions will work on a Surface device, not just the current ones, but ones that maybe have been in market for a while. So again, we don't release anything that we ourselves can't consume. And if you go back to the whole idea and the vision behind Surface devices, is really of, what we wanted to have like a guiding light for our OEM partners and just in general, and say, what is possible from an endpoint? How can it be so valuable as a component of the overall delivery of an experience, an end user experience with security and collaboration, all the other things that you want to try to get done, because people don't use devices for the sake of using a device, right? They're trying to get something done. They're trying to run an application. They're trying to get their job done, or they're trying to do something in their personal life. And if you make it so much about the device that the focus becomes the device, that gets in the way of them doing what they need to do. And that goes back to the whole idea of Surface devices are trying to be as transparent as they possibly can, well, being as performant as they can be and protecting the end user and the organization for that matter.
Yeah. Great points. Hey, Ben, thanks for that. That was really interesting.
Oh, happy to do it, Lex. Hope you found it valuable.
Yeah. So I do have one question. So we've talked about the environment, right? Tony did a great job describing the environment that you guys deal with, especially in healthcare. But I think that description really applies to a lot of different environments. And Ben, you talked about defense in depth. You talked about the devices and managing the devices and making sure that you bought devices that were incredibly secure or that we could help you manage the security on. But how does a customer tie that all together? And if a customer needs services, workshops, training, et cetera, I think we have an agency that deals with that, don't we?
Yeah, I think we do, Lex. And I'll take an opportunity to jump in there. So thanks, Tony and Ben, for doing a fantastic job. So I'll do my best to screw it up. So I just definitely wanted to talk about, you're talking about, modern devices, the modern, environment that we face. And Microsoft, for those that aren't aware, just recently modernized their support experience. And so, the Premier, as some customers know it, I call it enterprise service support, right? So, that has undergone a radical change. Legacy Premier, as we know it, that debuted in the early 90s, that is being retired, and its replacement, and only and essentially in name only, because it's a completely new experience, is what we're calling now Microsoft Unified Support. And just to take a step back to just kind of cover some of the big differences between the two, is initially we got a lot of customer feedback around our legacy support model. Number one, it didn't really align with their budget cycles. The cost projections was very difficult. And again, there wasn't a lot of services that enabled them, like you were saying, Lex, to actually operationalize all these investments. And as much as we would like everybody to put all their eggs in the Microsoft basket, they have other technologies and things that they're working on. And so this new model is called Unified Support. And again, it's really to help customers digitally transform, right? As part of digital services, we want to make every business a digital business, right? And specifically in healthcare, that's very important for the patient care experience. And so just wanted to kind of dig into that just a little bit to share some of the changes that we've made around it and some of the benefits that enterprise service customers have by partnering with Microsoft to enable some of these amazing scenarios. And again, the more things become digital, more they come online, the more things are pushed to the edge, the more security is going to be even more important than it ever was, right? And so again, these things aren't new to IT. So number one, pressure, right? IT is traditionally a cost center, right? So cost justification, return on investment is really critical, right? Again, how do the teams and the customers themselves extract maximum value from the tools and services that they purchased, right? And then again, how do they continually have an eye into the future to see what's coming down the pike to make sure that they're absorbing it appropriately? And so those are just some of the key benefits and things that we target within the unified support model. Right. And so again, one of the four pillars that we really highlight with customers is as needed support. So in the historical model, we did a lot of bean counting, right? There was a lot of administrative overhead watching the meter to make sure, because again, if you went over that cost projection, and sometimes that could be 12 to 18 months in advance, you were going to write a check, right? Historically, there could be situations where the Microsoft support agreement only applied to a certain subset of the entire IT staff, right? And so one of the big changes is we now have organizational wide coverage, right? So when you step into the unified support model, you now have your entire organization covered for every piece of Microsoft technology in the stack that you own. So that's a big boom. Obviously, another thing is outcome focused, right? So obviously you have all this stuff. Well, what do you want to do with it? This agreement is really geared toward not just, returning you back to normal state, but again, continually adding and increasing the pace in which you roll out changes and features to your customers, right? A lot of folks now these days have a mobile device, right? They have their own personal devices. They see the speed of change in which those things happen. They want to see that in their enterprise workspace. And when there's that lag, that's where you get what we call shadow IT. Right. And again, obviously connection through digital experiences is of the utmost focus for pretty much every company, especially in the healthcare space. So I definitely wanted to touch on some of that and some of the things that, Tony and Ben brought up. So, they initially talked about the WannaCry. So I'm a technical account manager. I've got some enterprise customers. And even though we did a really good job around posting some information on how to, apply antidotes and remediations for some of these security threats that we face, even with all that information out there, some customers just had a comfort level with talking with somebody directly from Microsoft, right? So from a security position, not a lot of people know that Microsoft is a huge player in the security space. The amount of stuff that we do and isn't reported on is significant. And so when customers partner with us from an enterprise security perspective, they're tapping into that vast knowledge of resources, right? We have cybersecurity incident response essentially on retainer for customers when these situations arise, so they can come directly to our technical experts that deal with this stuff on a day-to-day basis and make sure that their environment is secure as possible. And so we saw a lot of activity with our customer base around events like WannaCry, Petya, things like that. Just because the information's out there, and Microsoft puts a lot of information out there, sometimes customers, especially in a security situation, only want to know what they need to know. So we definitely partner and assist customers through there. So responding to real world events, enterprise services, Microsoft services, whether it be, unified support or consulting services, sisters and brothers work well together to prevent customers from being impacted from security events, or in the unfortunate events that they are compromised, to help them recover as quickly as possible. Another thing that Ben had talked about is from a low-hanging fruit perspective, the unified support model is set up phenomenally to really address these. And so historically, in the legacy Premier environment, the assessment in which we do two things, right? We review your current state, your health, right, and your risks or future state, right? Those were individual line items and transactions that customers had to forecast and account for from a budgeting standpoint, right? In the new model, we provide all of our customers all of access to all of our assessment technologies as part of their base agreement, right? So customers can, at a minimum, continually get operational insight on their environment across the entire portfolio stack. One of the exciting things around that assessment piece is now we've started to branch out from on-premise to our cloud technologies. So customers that have Microsoft 365 can get operational insight around their O365 deployment, their SharePoint Online, and Teams and Skype to make sure that just because it's a cloud technology that they're not exposed. So that's been something that's been huge. Another piece, and again, as somebody that's a formal technical guy that in a long lifetime ago, technical readiness is always something that I'm laser focused in on, right? At the end of the day, the technology can be as great as we make it, but if we don't enable the staff to understand what that technology is so they can best deploy it in their environment to their standards, then it doesn't really matter, right? And so one of the amazing things that's available in the unified support model is we've now opened up our entire portfolio, our entire catalog of workshops that can be employee driven, customer driven, which is over 2,500 or about 2,500 line items. That is included to the entire organization as well. So as customers look to adopt some of these technologies from an Office 365 perspective, from an Azure perspective, from a Dynamics perspective, they can not only understand and partner with enterprise services to deploy that technology, but in advance, they can upgrade the technical readiness of the staff that's going to be supporting and maintaining that technology, not only at deployment, but in the future. So that's a huge, huge change from the model that on the legacy Premier to moving forward. And then again, we talked about the customers, right? So not every customer is a Cigna or an Aetna or of these huge scale companies that have 5, 6, 100, 10,000 people that are in support, right? Some companies are very small, very cloud focused, and their staff is completely compressed, right? And as we talked about before, they might be wearing multiple hats. And so their need to be secured is just as important as these larger companies, but they don't always have the resources on staff to make some of this happen. And so we definitely have resources available as part of some of our agreements within unified support to really enable that. And we call those, what we call them is the support technology advisor. And what that does is that partners with a customer to help deploy a specific workload to the cloud. And so an example of that could be as a customer is moving, they finally invested in Microsoft 365. They're looking to deploy a critical workload and move something like Exchange. So mail is a commodity these days, looking to move that technology into the cloud, but they're just not sure how to go from knowledge base articles and technical documentation to really lighting that scenario up, right? And so these resources that are available now allow them to partner directly with Microsoft technical experts to help guide and plan that journey based on the customer's security requirements to those cloud technologies. And so just wanted to take a break there. Actually, before I do that, and one other thing that Ben brought up with the Surface device kind of blending into the hardware or into the background, I should say, when customers do partner and decide to deploy Surface devices, they have the benefit of leveraging that enterprise services agreement. So not only can they get support around their enterprise software, but the same number they call, the same benefits that they get extended from their software investment, then covers their hardware investment as well from one person, right? So one support agency supporting both their hardware and software with security being of the utmost importance.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm in PubSec, so I really haven't had a lot of experience with unified support, but it sounds like it's great.
Thanks for that, Lex. And I just wanted to dig a little bit deeper around the support technology advisor, because I'm a huge fan of this. And not only am I a huge fan of this, we're seeing explosive growth with our customer base, and the workloads and the focuses continue to expand specifically around security. So there's going to be some real exciting things that align with some of our announcements in terms of Azure security, security center, and things of that nature. But identity and security is an area where we're seeing significant demand for this resource. So I definitely wanted to just kind of jump in and at a high level kind of talk about this. So as you can see on the slide, assess, define, and attain an outcome is really the focus of the support technology advisor. And what do we mean by that? So I'm just going to go over the workloads available to a customer. And so as you can see right here, messaging is obviously one, but you'll see EMS. So customers that understand the value behind multi-factor authentication, right? So information protection, or just deploying the enterprise mobility suite, right? Customers see the value. They might already be licensed for the value, but they just don't have those resources on hand to really extract that value. This is where the support technology advisor really comes in and shines. It's very laser focused. So they might have additional enterprise services resources. They might have partners engaged. They might have our consulting services involved in this. But really, this resource comes in and just laser focus on enabling a specific outcome for the customer in kind of a controlled environment. And so again, I've personally had this with customers. I refer to myself as a team zealot. So that's been where our focus was. And that was been a significant success with our customer. But we are getting significant feedback around the security itself. And so the engagement itself is really kind of broken down. But one of the beautiful things of it is there's actually some digital collateral that we produce in conjunction with the customer. And so it really kind of comes in a phased approach. So the first phase is we really kind of conduct a knowledge transfer for the customer, right? So we really kind of dig in and provide at a 200, maybe 300 level, understanding the fabric of the technology that we are laser focused in on. And so from our instance that I'm thinking of, we talked about teams, right? So we understood under the covers, the O365 groups. We talked about the security elements, right? Because it's built on that security platform that is Office 365. And then we talked about outcomes, right? Here's what this could look like in your environment. The next thing we did is we met and talked with the customer to get to know their specific environment. Tell us about your security challenges. Tell us about your security posture. Tell us how you run your business, right? This isn't Microsoft coming in and saying, you will do this and you should do this. It's, hey, customer, tell us how we can come to you to better understand your environment. Right? We partner with them, we review that documentation, and then again, from there, we partner with them to create a digital job aid or some collateral. So at the end of the engagement, the customer is able to deploy the technology on their terms based on their security position. Right. And so that really kind of changes the conversation around, hey, Microsoft is going to make us change the way we run our business to Microsoft is going to come in and partner with us strategically to enable this workload, this outcome based on our specific environment, based on our specifications through conversations. Right. It's not just a lot of we're going to talk to you through a slide deck. It's a lot of dynamic conversations between the customer stakeholders and Microsoft to really enable that outcome. Something I'm very passionate about. And again, as I mentioned before, security is an area where we're seeing explosive demand and growth in this offering.
Yeah, absolutely. That was awesome. Thanks, Matt. That's killer, dude.
Yeah, glad to talk about it.
Yeah. Okay. So guys, listen, thank you so much for being guests on the show today. All of you did incredibly fascinating presentations. Wow, what a great show. I need to do multiple guests more often. Listen, thanks again. Thank you for doing this for us. And guys, without further ado, that's your taste of Premiere.
Thanks, Lex.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Lex.
Lex. Thanks for having us.